welcome to the Roundtable Perspective. I'm your host, Tom Roach. I'm joined by my guest today, Dr. Molly Schneider. Molly is a television historian, and we're going to talk about what she does. She has a Ph.D. in screen cultures from Northwestern University, and she teaches at at Columbia College in Chicago, right?
Right.
So Molly, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Tell us, what does a television historian do?
So it's funny that you asked me that question, because usually it's parents of students who are asking me that question when I introduce myself as a television historian, and I get the look in the face of, that's a thing? It's a thing. So essentially, I am not a TV producer, I'm not a TV maker, I'm not a filmmaker. What I do is look at the history of television as a medium, the history of television as an important part of American culture and in terms of world culture. And so when I teach at Columbia College Chicago, I'm not the one teaching them how to use the camera, I'm not the one sort of teaching them broadcast techniques. I'm the one teaching them the history of television, or the theory of television, or analysis of television in a sort of cultural context.
Okay, and who, are the people that produce these TV shows interested in what you're doing, or are they operating sort of oblivious to this? How does this fit together?
In many cases they are. It sort of depends on the person, obviously, but I think in a lot of cases, when you have a showrunner in particular who, and this is especially, I think, interesting to showrunners who are doing sort of period shows or historical shows, want to get an understanding of, what's the context of this program that I'm making, or what are the historical details that might have been relevant at the time, or how would the media of this time period that I'm talking about have influenced the kinds of discussions that would have been had, and what was the cultural consciousness.
So they might be working on a project that they want to somehow reflect Twilight Zone or Naked City or something, right? And they might call in someone with your background to provide some context.
Yeah, and I think also when we teach TV history at the college level to students who are planning on working in the television industry or in the film industry, we think it's really important for them to understand sort of where that medium came from, how that medium has a particular history that developed in particular ways. And it also just makes them more conversant in a medium. And so if they come up with an idea, they can sort of understand how this fits within what's been done before, how does it fit within certain types of traditions, certain genres, so they can be conversant in a wider range of their field, and so they can walk into an interview and make it clear that they understand the historical dimension of what they're doing.
So that's from the pure teaching side of it, right? Preparing people to go out and have careers. But just looking at this from a more pure academic standpoint, would you say you're more interested in the actual history of the plots and the character development and things like that, or more in the development of the medium?
Well, I sort of like to sit in the intersection of all of those things, but for the most part, I'm interested in kind of what was happening to make the shows the way that they were. So I do a lot of archival research, so I will go to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, or I'll go to UCLA, and I'll dig through their archives, not only of programs, but also their paper archives. So I'll look at letters that Rod Serling wrote between the network. I'll look at censorship reports saying this is what you can do and this is what you can't do.
I'll bet Rod Serling wrote great letters.
Oh, he wrote amazing letters.
Oh, really?
Oh, they're amazing. I mean, you can always count on Serling for a really, really snotty but smart and clever letter. And he was not shy about expressing his displeasure.
No kidding.
And because he did a lot of shows about pretty political issues and was pretty heavily censored in some notorious cases, and was really upset about it and would go to the press and complain about it when he had enough prestige to do that.
Yeah. Now, I know he's an example of the area that you're most interested in here, right? And you call this anthologies?
Right. So the format that I work on most is called the anthology drama. Sometimes the anthology series. Most of them are dramas. There are some comedies. And so an anthology is a type of show where each individual episode is self-contained. So each week is a different story with different characters, with a different plot. And The Twilight Zone is, of course, the most famous example that most people have seen because it's been syndicated for so many years, and it's now being rebooted.
It wasn't the most watched at the time, though, was it? It seems I remember people, I was pretty young, but I remember more focus on things like the Alfred Hitchcock Hour. Was it the Alfred Hitchcock Hour? Was that the name of it? Or
Well, there were several versions of that show. There was the Alfred Hitchcock Presents, and then there was the Alfred
Yeah.
Hitchcock Hour. Right, so The Twilight Zone was critically acclaimed and had ratings that were sort of good enough to
Right.
keep it on the air for a few years. At a certain point, the network did try to cancel it, but then they sort of revived it after the third season, and that's when it went to an hour-long show, which basically nobody liked the hour-long time slot.
Did they change the name to Night Gallery at that point, or am I thinking of
No,
something
that was a
different?
different show. Yeah,
Oh, okay.
that was the show he did afterwards. He also did a show called The Loner afterwards, but the next anthology he did was Night Gallery,
Okay.
which was never quite as popular or acclaimed as The Twilight Zone.
Right. What were some of these early anthologies? So we mentioned Twilight Zone and Alfred Hitchcock Presents. There was something Playhouse Theater.
There were tons of these. Playhouse 90 is one of the most famous ones.
Okay.
It was probably the most prestigious one, so I've done quite a bit of
Yeah.
research on some specific episodes of Playhouse 90. There was also Goodyear Television Playhouse, and that is the program that first aired Marty by Patty Chayefsky, which is now better known for its feature film adaptation, but it actually first was a live television broadcast.
The feature film with
So the feature film had Ernest Borgnine.
Ernest Borgnine. Yes, okay, I know the movie.
Yeah, but it actually started as a live television anthology,
Yeah, it's kind of
starring Rod Steiger.
Yeah, it was kind of a Tennessee Williams kind of plot. It was like, middle income Americans
That's
leading,
right. That's right.
sort of indescript lives, and yeah.
Right. So in a lot of cases, it's been referred to as a slice of life drama. That's a term that's really before had been used in terms of some British dramas.
Yeah.
But it started to be used with some of these anthology dramas because they were these portraits of sort of everyday people living
Yeah.
everyday lives. They didn't speak with Hollywood accents. They didn't live in, palatial houses. They were sort of everyday people, sort of psychological dramas. And part of that had to do with the fact that television studios were small and the budgets were small, and so they had to sort of keep the scale small and sort of focus on character and sort of psychological drama in a lot of cases.
And literature during that period, we're talking the 1950s, kind of had that kind of a focus, didn't it? Wasn't a lot of the drama
In
on
some
Broadway
cases.
Similar to that?
That's right. In some cases, the literature for sure. Also, some of the Broadway plays that were coming out at the time were really similar in their themes. And this is also the time when method acting becomes really, really popular, especially in New York. And actually, a lot of method actors from the Actors Studio and some other studios ended up working on these anthology dramas because they could do TV on the nights when they weren't doing plays.
Yeah, it's interesting to go back and watch old 50s black and white shows and see all of the stars that we came to know
That's right.
later on. Speaking of Twilight Zone, I'm sure everyone who knows anything about William Shatner knows that he was on one of the most famous Star Trek, or one of the most famous Twilight Zone episodes. I think he's like passenger on a plane, and there's a gremlin on the wing taking the
the
engine
it's
apart.
20,000 feet. I'm forgetting the full title of it, but Terror at 20,000 feet, I think is what it's called.
Yeah.
Right, Robert Redford was in some of these anthology dramas.
Burgess Meredith, I
Burgess
think,
Meredith
is
was in several of
the
them.
man who was the only surviving member of humanity, and he likes to read, and he breaks his glasses, right?
Time Enough at Last is the name of it.
Okay, yeah. So,
and he was in several of those.
So one of the characteristics, I think, of shows during this period was that people were not just looking at the actors and the plots and things, but they were aware of the writers, weren't they? It seems to me that writers kind of sold things a little bit back then.
That's right. So obviously the figure of the television writer becomes a new sort of cultural figure in the 1950s.
Yeah.
And in some cases, early TV was written by people who had been writing for radio or people who had been writing for the stage. But eventually, television sort of realized we're going to need to have people who are trained in writing for television specifically, especially writing original drama for television, because we've used up all of our adaptations. Everybody's, even by the late 40s, people were complaining that they were just seeing the same stuff over and over, just adaptations of Shakespeare because you didn't have to pay for royalties, and adaptations of stage plays. So eventually they realized, well, we're going to have to write some original scripts for TV, and we're going to have to hire playwrights to do it.
Right.
So we had this kind of elite group of playwrights that really made a name for themselves, like Rod Serling, like Reginald Rose, like Robert Allen Arthur, a lot of playwrights who came to be household names that really helped sell, especially the anthology drama, as high quality, Broadway caliber drama that would come into your living room.
And then, of course, the directors, too. So Alfred Hitchcock, sort of, in some ways, was the height of his reputation during that period, and he was on TV. So all of this, didn't it give television then a kind of highbrow, classy aura, right?
It did, and that was kind of one of the most important things about the anthology drama, is that it really helped television sort of claim this sort of good reputation, because when television first entered into American homes, there was a lot of concern about what it would do to the American home. Everything from, is it going to strain my eyes, to is it going to turn my children into delinquents, and what's it going to do to my home life, and also just where am I going to put this humongous machine in my house? And so the anthology dramas, and especially the ones that were considered the high quality ones, sort of ended up being a way that the TV industry could prove, look, TV is actually going to be a good influence on American culture. It's going to sort of raise the cultural level of people all over the country. Even if you can't access Broadway, you can still access, this culture with a capital C. And we're not going to rot your brain. We're actually going to bring you this really important cultural uplift. And television is providing this public service to the nation. So the anthology drama really became one of the ways that television networks, but also their sponsors, were able to prove that they were providing the American public with this really important service.
Mm-hmm. And of course, later on, is it in the 60s that the famous quote is made? Is it Newton Minow? He says television is a vast wasteland. Was that?
Yes, 1961.
61, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And he was an academic, right? Was he? He had a Northwestern connection, I recall.
He's a lawyer. He's got a law degree, but he was the commissioner of the FCC under JFK.
Okay.
And so you're right, he gave this very famous speech. It was, I believe, his first kind of major speech as commissioner of the FCC. And it was to the Television Broadcasters Association.
How did he say that? I mean, Hee Haw hadn't come out yet. There was no Saturday Night Live. We hadn't seen Rosanna. What was he looking at?
So he essentially went in front of broadcasters and said, your programming's not good enough. I don't think even you would like sitting there and watching your own broadcasts. I dare you to try it. I don't think you'll like it. There's some really good programming on there, and we should do more of that, but also there's some really bad programming, and you need to do better. Which, of course, the broadcasters did not appreciate one bit, but he essentially said, listen, there's a lot of really good TV, some stuff you're doing really well at, but there's also some really terrible TV. You are not fulfilling your obligation to the American public, because in exchange for your license to broadcast, you have to provide some sort of public good or some sort of service in the public interest, and you're not doing it. And so I dare you to sit down in front of your own channels and watch it, and you will find a vast wasteland.
It's like asking the cigarette moguls to smoke cigarettes, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and so it was, kind of, he started the job with a bang. They didn't like that very much.
We're still quoting him,
Exactly.
He had an impact.
Yeah, I mean, and it's really interesting because that quote has been used so much, but if you actually read the speech, he's not saying all television is terrible, why do we have TV? He actually says when television is good, nothing is better. He's really, really championing the possibilities of television for being this amazing sort of presence in American life, and that good TV is a service to the nation, and that there is some really good TV, and we should keep doing that. But we can't sort of just give everybody their candy. We have to give them their vegetables too. And the other thing he was saying, that television is starting to sort of have a global reach, and is this really what we want representing the United States?
Very prophetic, wasn't it?
He was. So it's a really interesting speech, because often it's thought of as just bashing television as terrible, but it's really not. It's saying television is amazing, but you're not fulfilling your part of the bargain.
He made his point in a very memorable way.
He did.
Do you think that's possibly because television was transitioning away from that highbrow, theater, intellectual mode that it was in, into something that was going to eventually give us more things along the lines of I Love Lucy and...
I think certainly that's the way a lot of people felt. Whether that was the reality is sort of a different question. But shows like these highbrow anthologies really started disappearing by the end of the 50s. And by 1960, there were very few left. Playhouse 90, the last episode was 1960, and Gore Vidal, who did write one or two anthologies, declared the end of Playhouse 90 as television's last gasp.
So it was all over.
Right, according to him, TV
Right.
was over now. But the interesting thing is it's not actually true that all TV was highbrow or even that all these anthologies were highbrow. It's just that they were really, really symbolic about a sort of promise about what TV could do. And when they started to disappear and programming started to change and also production started moving more from New York to Los Angeles, a lot of people felt that TV was kind of losing its prestige and losing its kind of mission to be quality. Whether that's true or not is a really difficult question, but certainly a lot of people felt that way.
Well, certainly differences between the arts culture in New York and in Los Angeles. So, you know, if you think of it in terms of where we're at today, a lot of people feel that we're having a resurgence, that TV is providing more meaningful scripts and stories and character studies, things like that. How do you feel about that? What evidence is there of that?
You know, I think that it may or may not be true, but basically that claim is made every 10 or 15 years. Oh,
Yeah.
now we're in a new golden age. No, now this is the golden age. So I wouldn't say it's untrue because I don't think it's really a question of fact. It certainly is a major part of the cultural discourse right now, especially in this discussion of what we call peak TV, which is the idea that there's so much TV out there, you couldn't possibly watch it all, and so much of it is so good, how could you possibly choose? But really, we've sort of had people claiming that we're in a new golden age many times since what is referred to as the golden age in the 1950s.
So some people at the same time are saying it's a wasteland and some are saying golden age.
Right, and so I suppose you could say that there have been certain points on the timeline that people have specifically thought were particularly good.
So what are some of the high points in television history from your point of view?
Well, as a fan or as a scholar?
Both. Well, I'll take both. Go ahead. Obviously, you watch a lot of TV, or you
Right.
wouldn't be in this field, right? So
oftentimes there's this what is sometimes referred to as TV's second golden age is basically the late 80s and early 90s when you have shows like Hill Street Blues.
Yeah.
Which is one of the...
I was thinking of Hill Street Blues.
Right, yeah, and it's one of those shows that really gets tapped a lot as being sort of the beginning of the second golden age of television because it was a cop show that had sort of psychological depth, and and it was artistic, and it was edgy, and...
I was watching, just, you know, peripherally watching it one day, and this one of the cops is in the break room, and he's banging on the Coke machine, and the can isn't coming out, and he screams, "Open the pod bay door, Hal," and he pounds on the machine. And I thought, my gosh, that's a reference to 2001 Space Odyssey.
Yeah.
This has got a script.
Right, yeah, and I mean, and also remember, this is before DVD players, this is before streaming. It's not like, you know, everybody could just queue up 2001 anytime they wanted to watch it. So,
right.
So that's usually talked about
so
as a
80s,
point.
late 80s.
Late 80s, early 90s. But then, I mean, it also depends on who you ask. If you ask, you know, NBC, they would say it was 1995, 1996 with their classic Thursday night must-see TV lineup with Friends and Seinfeld and Will and Grace, and that sort of just owned Thursday night.
Well, let's look at that for a second. I mean, so they think that was important, but was it? I mean, was there anything really significant going on there in terms of the American culture or the history of TV?
I think there was. I think that it sort of shows us some of the shifts that are happening in broadcast television around that time. So when you have block programming like this, which is what that is, you know, NBC would sort of block together their Thursday night lineup, and the idea would be that they want you to keep your TV tuned to NBC for hours at a time, right? They want you to start with the local news, and then you have your 2 sitcoms, and then you have your 1-hour drama, which for 15 years was ER, and then you watch your 10 o'clock news, and then you watch your late night shows, and then you watch your late night shows. So they want to keep you watching their show for a really long time. And so block programming becomes important in the 80s and the 90s to sort of brand the network and also to brand a certain...
But what about those block programs? I mean, you know, were they exploring territory here? You know, if you think about it, because we're talking about comedy now, right?
Yeah.
If you think about comedy in the 50s and 60s, the comedians were you know, they were thinkers, they were philosophers, they were questioning American culture, they were offering a lot of cultural critique. So I think if you look at, not Bob Newhart's TV show, but if you look at his stand-up comedy, if you look at Jonathan Winters and, you know, those people that were, you know, going on the late night shows all the time, Jack Parr and then Johnny Carson and all that, they were poking holes in the culture in a lot of ways. You know, those shows that were supposed to be so good in the, you know, what were the years you said, 90?
About the mid-90s.
Mid-90s on NBC. I mean, were they doing that, or were they just reflecting what was going on?
I think in some cases they were, and it depends on which show you're talking about. For example, ER really was doing that, but ER wasn't a comedy, right? ER was talking about the AIDS crisis, it was talking about poverty, it was talking about racism, it was talking about a lot of these issues. The sitcoms were not necessarily doing that on a large scale, but what they were doing is targeting a sort of young, hip, urban, sort of 20-something and 30-something market. Partly because they were really terrified of what cable could do, and if that would steal their young, hip audience away.
Right.
So cable was sort of doing the edgier stuff, and the networks and the broadcast networks, which couldn't do the same level of edgy stuff, were sort of trying to keep up and sort of trying to go in that direction and not being able to do it in the same way.
And that's why they were doing it. But what's curious to me is why they were so effective doing it. Because I just remember during that period, people were quoting those shows all the time. You'd have a conversation with somebody and they'd say, "Oh, it's like that Seinfeld episode," and then they'd start talking about, and then four other people in the room would go, "Oh yeah, I saw that," and they'd all be laughing together. I don't
really
remember that happening so much since the 50s, really.
Yeah, and I think, a lot of those shows really were what we call water cooler shows, where, enough people watched it where you could go and talk about it at work the next day. Especially those Thursday nights where, they were just winning in the ratings. Nobody was going to catch them. And that was, probably one of the last times when we had that on such a large scale. So at the same time that networks are trying to target a particular audience a little bit more than they had in the past, they're also creating this water cooler kind of appointment television that they want people to be buzzy about. And it's much harder to have that now because people and audiences are spread so thinly over so many different shows.
But I just want to look at that a little bit more. So one of the things that I'm understanding about the 50s is that they felt that television was going to be influential, and they wanted it to be responsible in what it was airing, right?
Some people did, yes.
Yes, okay. Well, I mean, a lot of people did because a lot of the shows were very, serious-minded, had literary qualities.
The ones that we the ones that have survived in memory often were.
Well, I was there. I remember, I started out with Howdy Doody, but I ended up with Hitchcock Presents. But what? I guess what I'm wondering is, do you think that something like Seinfeld was reflecting American culture more, or was it leading American culture? What, if you say Seinfeld and Friends, where does that balance tip for them?
Well, I mean, that's a tough question, and I tend to not want to fall one way or the other on that. I tend to think of television as not just reflecting what's happening and not just influencing what's happening, but kind of engaging in this really intricate kind of feedback with what's happening in larger culture. Because certainly shows like Seinfeld and Friends were deeply influential, but also they were reflecting things about their particular time. So yeah, I tend not to fall one way or the other on that.
Okay, and then just I was asking you before your favorite periods or shows. I mean, let's take me past Seinfeld and Friends now. What comes next?
Well, for many people, 1999 is really the moment where TV changes because that is when we have The Sopranos.
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 Okay.
Well, The West Wing is also really interesting because it was basically this kind of highbrow drama that was on NBC. That was one of the last times we sort of saw a show like that.
Although it was also a show where people knew who the writer was.
That's right. So Aaron Sorkin was very much a branded name at the time.
And that's rare today, I think, right?
Well, now it's really the showrunners that are the known names like Kenya Barris and Shonda Rhimes, and so it's sort of shifted in that way. But so 99 is when we have The Sopranos, and many people think that The Sopranos was a really, really important turning point in television because it proved that original cable dramas could be successful and that they could siphon audiences away from network programming because they could do more. Now, I tend to think that it started before Sopranos. I think maybe it's given a little bit too much credit. But the rise of the original cable series that was considered high quality, that was considered edgy, that could do things that broadcast TV couldn't do, is really important in sort of 99, early 2000s.
Thank you very much. That's all the time we have for our program. And I want to thank Molly Schneider, Dr. Molly Schneider, for joining us today on Roundtable Perspective. I'm Tom Roach. See you next time.